Why do we need to exist? Well, unfortunately, disasters happen around the world and affect people on every continent. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along and hearing about what is, next to my family, is my first passion, and that's ShelterBox. A lot of people in the UK have not heard of ShelterBox because we are a tiny, tiny charity by comparison with many of the larger non-governmental organisations that exist around the world, like the Red Cross, Save the Children, and numerous others. But what we do believe to do is to give absolute care and accountability for the donations that people give us. In Nepal, just recently they had a large earthquake that made our news screens. Within a few weeks, it had paled. We didn't know any more about it, but the work there still needed to go on. What ShelterBox does is it takes homes to people in those situations where it can provide support for them to get back on their feet. We're not the complete answer. We're an emergency response humanitarian disaster relief agency. Now, for 40 years, I used to be a policeman. And during that time, I attended what I thought were lots and lots of very big disasters. Things like the Herald of Free Enterprise that capsized in the English Channel. The Paddington train crash, in which over 189 people lost their lives. It's things like that that I thought were big disasters. Then I retired, and the Asian tsunami happened back in 2004. In 2005, I went to Sri Lanka and saw the devastation that Mother Nature was able to create as a result of that enormous act. And since then, I've been working as a volunteer with ShelterBox, because ShelterBox relies on volunteers for much of the work that it does, and it's people like me that are trained to go out and deliver aid to people around the world to help them get back on their feet when they've lost their homes, and very often their loved ones. Why do we need to do that? At this moment in time, 27.5 million people around the world are without any home whatsoever. They don't even have the luxury, dare I say it, of the kind of tents that we're all living in here on the site at KIJ. They literally are trying to find any shelter they possibly can. It might be a cave, it might be just a bent over tree branch or a piece of polythene. But they don't have anywhere that they can literally call home because they've been affected by floods, landslides, tsunami, volcanic eruption, famine, drought, all of those things. And of course, conflict. Conflict accounts for another 66 million people who are affected and have had to be displaced from their homes or have had their homes destroyed. So at this moment in time, 1 in 84 people on this planet, 1 in 84 people on this planet don't have a roof over their head and a place that they can call home because of either natural disaster or because of conflict. And it's those people that ShelterBox exists to try and help. And we do it by taking aid to countries, and people like me go into the country, and when we arrive there, we're a guest in that country. We have no power to make any decisions about how the response to the disaster might be managed, but what we do have is tremendous experience and big influence, because we're affiliated with Rotary International, and that means that although we only have one headquarters in the world, and that's down in Cornwall, we do have 32,000 local offices around the world. They're called Rotary Clubs, and they don't cost us a bean, which means that every penny that people donate to ShelterBox has a bigger chance of getting to provide the equipment that people need around the world when they're affected by disaster, like Malaysia that you just saw on the screen there, or in the earthquake in Nepal, or here in the Philippines that was struck by a super typhoon and had the equivalent of a tidal wave that was like a tsunami and killed 8,500 people in the space of about an hour. And it's places like that that ShelterBox goes to. We go to the most far out of the reach places to try and do what we do. This bit of video explains a bit more about how we work.
Imagine a situation where you've lost everything, whether through earthquake or flood, tsunami or cyclone, volcano or conflict. What would you and your family need to survive? Imagine a situation where you've lost everything. Then a green box arrives, a shelter box.
It started out as a very simple concept. What would you need for your family if you lost everything in a disaster? A strong, tried and tested tent for shelter, some thermal blankets, ground sheets, hats and gloves for warmth, mosquito nets and a water filter to protect your family from disease, pots and pans to cook with, a toolkit to repair your home to earn your living. Basically life-saving, life-changing, very essential equipment.
ShelterBox relies on volunteers and donations to make its work possible. Your gift of time or money can help save lives and give new hope to families who have lost everything. Bringing shelter, warmth and dignity in the shape of a green box.
So that's what ShelterBox does. It does what it says on the tin, or in this case on the box. It provides shelter in a box and lots of other essential aids that people need to try and get back on their feet. So why are we at KIJ? Well, I'll tell you why we're here. Wherever I go in the world on behalf of ShelterBox, one of the things I look for on my way to the disaster site are scout groups and guide groups. Why? Because I know from experience they work longer and harder in helping us build tents and put people under shelter than any of the armed police forces, the fire service, the military, anybody else that I've ever worked with don't compare with the amount of enthusiasm and spirit that scouts and guides bring to that task of putting people under some safe shelter. And that's why I look for scout groups when I'm on my way to the disaster. I was in Brazil and I had to travel from Rio de Janeiro out 2.5 hours to get to the site of the disaster and then go another 6 hours to move on to the next site of disaster. The following weekend after I arrived, minibuses of scouts travelled that 8.5 hours from Rio de Janeiro out to the site that I was working at, camped overnight for 3 days, and during that time put up 75 tents and put people, 75 families, under shelter because their homes had been swept away in landslides and flooding. That's why I believe that scouts are the best thing since sliced bread when it comes to helping me help the people through ShelterBox. You saw in the video what's in the box, but if you want to come and see and feel what's in the box, then come to the ShelterBox display and we'll let you experience that firsthand. During that time, we'll invite you to take part in a couple of competitions that we're running to enable your scout groups and guide group to hopefully win £100 as a prize for being the fastest to complete our tasks during the week. One's an obstacle course. We'll put you over some raging rapids. Actually, it's a bit of tarpaulin on the ground, but it looks like raging rapids if you use your imagination. We'll get you to do what you do best, put up tents. I hear some of you probably grimacing about that because the efforts that you put into it on Saturday night weren't exactly a practiced testament to how good you are at that yet. But you learn very quickly, I've discovered, and I think we've got down to about 8 minutes now for the fastest team getting through our obstacle challenge, answering questions about ShelterBox, braving those raging rapids and putting up the tent. The other challenge is an orienteering challenge. We'll give you a compass and some directions to follow, and your objective is to navigate around the site, identify some clues that we've left, and then come back and tell us what they were in the fastest time possible, and you could win the £100 for your group, or if you're a runner-up, 30 quid that we've managed to get from Cotswold Outdoor. So that's what you can do while you're here at the KIJ. Experience ShelterBox firsthand in all its glory. We also provide, as well as the tents these days, we take a shelter repair kit that enables us to help more people more flexibly. To provide a shelter box costs £590. To provide a shelter kit that you can build a very substantial shelter with will cost £35. So we can help a lot more people using shelter kits than we could possibly do with just tents and boxes alone. But we'll respond to wherever is needed in the world with the appropriate kit that is going to best help the people that we go to see. Our philosophy is, if you're going to help somebody, you give them the best you possibly can. You don't give them a cast-off, ripped tent that somebody no longer wants. You give them the best that you possibly can. And because ShelterBox is now able to buy stuff in quite large quantity, it means that the kit that we can provide can come at reasonably priced costs, and it means that we can help more people with better quality kit, as we've always tried to do. This, if you can see it, is a picture of what that shelter kit could be turned into. You just add wood, and here's one I did earlier. This was actually me down in Cornwall on my last training course. We have to go through training, as you might imagine, and in order to get out and deliver this stuff in the field, and there's quite an intense selection process. But what I'm going to do after I finish talking here is invite any of you leaders who would like to become a ShelterBox ambassador to come and see us over in the ShelterBox area, where we can tell you more about the kit, and that will empower you to go out and talk to others. As a result of that, we'll give you a certificate and a little badge that you can wear on your uniform to justify that you've been authenticated by ShelterBox to act on our behalf to go and spread the word. The one thing we can't do enough of is raise awareness, because that's going to be the key to our success. Last year, we helped 168,000 people, families, get them under shelter. Our objective by 2025 is to help 1 million people a year. Now, that's a big jump and requires us to expand exponentially to get to where we want to be. But it is possible. This is what we did last year. 14 countries, 148,000 people served. We were in the Philippines, Paraguay for flooding, Fiji for Typhoon Winston, Ecuador for earthquake, Sri Lanka for landslides and flooding, North Korea for flooding. We don't care what politics people have. Haiti for a hurricane, Iraq for refugees, Cameroon for refugees, Niger for refugees, Syria for refugees. Wherever we're needed, we'll go and we'll take this vital kit. But we can't do any of that without help from people who donate to enable us in ShelterBox to buy the kit that we take out to those places.
You raise me up so I can't stand on my...
This is some video from Haiti when I went there in 2010. 2.3 million people were under shelter or without shelter. Families were completely destroyed by an earthquake that lasted no more than about 1.5 minutes in the main strike. Hundreds of thousands were injured. The worst place to be was actually in a hospital, because they were 3 or 4 story buildings that collapsed like a pack of cards. ShelterBox sent everything it had to Haiti that year. We sent 32,500 tents. From a tiny charity operating in the UK, that's an absolutely phenomenal input. It was 30% of everything that went to Haiti. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, with one of the highest death rates of children under 12 months of anywhere in the world. Sheets held up by sticks just like that were homes for people in Haiti. It was the rainy season, and at night you could hear children crying, and it was the most melancholy sound you could possibly imagine, over miles, and I mean miles. The KIJ site is about 1/10 of the size of the area of one of the camps that we were working in. And at night, the melancholy cries of the children was absolutely devastating. But in the morning, the sun came out and the kids are running around laughing, enjoying life. It's a testament to the spirit of people who live in places where they're not as lucky as we happen to be just because we were born in the UK or live here now. That mum and baby is why I give up as much time as I possibly can to ShelterBox, because she reminded me of one of my grandchildren who was about the same age at that time, and I wouldn't want them to be in that situation and have to say, as I did to that mum, I'm sorry, I don't have any more aid to give. If I get some more, I'll try and come back, but I never knew whether I'd be able to or not. It doesn't matter where in the world we're needed. I was asked to go to Brazil, as I mentioned earlier. And I went to Rio do Sul, which is in the south of Brazil, where they'd suffered massive flooding. They'd had almost a year's worth of rain in a couple of weeks. That city was flooded, because it's in a valley, up to a height of 16 feet, which meant most of the houses were covered. Most of the houses were made of brick and would dry out. The river originally ran through the centre of that valley where the yellow arrows are, and the people on the hillsides thought that they'd been clever by building high until the hillside started to crash down onto the homes that were at the bottom of the hills. And 7 people died in their beds at 3 a.m. on the morning I arrived because they thought they were safe. But sadly, the mud and the silt that was on the hillside on volcanic rock meant that the weight of the water in all that silt and mud meant all the foliage, the trees and the rocks just slid down and crushed thousands of tons, crushing what was underneath. And of course that was people in their homes. We were there to help people like this who lived by the river and were among the poorest. Their houses were made of wood and wouldn't withstand the torrential rains and the floodwaters that were tearing through that particular valley. As you can see in that one, the walls have completely washed away and all that's left is the roof flat on the ground. We shipped in shelter boxes using Rotary clubs in Brazil who paid for the transport to get the boxes transported from Rio de Janeiro down to the valley in Rio do Sul. And the boxes arrived at 6 p.m. on a Saturday night. By 8 p.m. we'd unloaded the trucks and we're giving the first box and tent to the first family. This is Mum and 3 children. The dad, Daniel Pires, was watching what was going on. And when we started to get the tent out of the box, he became panicky. He was saying in Portuguese, "Stop, stop." I didn't understand what he was saying because I don't speak Portuguese, but the interpreter told me. So I said, well, what's his problem? And he says he can't afford this. But of course I was able to say, no, he hasn't understood properly. This is a gift. Somebody on the other side of the world has sent me with this to give to Daniel and his family as a gift to try and get them back on their feet. He'll never have to pay for this, and when he's finished with it, he's welcome to do with it whatever he feels is appropriate. Give it to somebody else, sell it, we don't care. We just want to help that family get their life back together and recover as best they possibly can. Daniel couldn't believe that, and he broke down in tears, we broke down in tears, the kids broke down in tears. After we'd all had a good cry, we started putting up more tents for more families. I was asked to go to Niger in Central Africa because they'd had flooding. Now in Central Africa, in sub-Saharan desert country, you wouldn't expect there to be flooding, but it happens quite regularly. In fact, we were there recently because of the same sort of problem. But this is Niger in Central Africa. When I arrived, on the night I arrived, 7 aid workers were kidnapped. Now I thought when I volunteered for ShelterBox, the biggest threat would be earthquakes, tsunami, volcanic eruptions. I've got to tell you, none of those things bother me too much. The biggest threat against aid workers the world over now is terrorism and the threat of being kidnapped. And so whenever we go anywhere, we train all our people to be very, very wary about how they conduct themselves. Sometimes we'll go non-branded, so we don't look like a walking advert for somebody to kidnap us and think that ShelterBox will pay a fortune. They won't, because they haven't got a fortune and they probably don't care about me that much. So we're very, very careful. And anyway, that's not why we're with the charity. But the bit of video I'm going to show you gives some idea of what it's like in those situations. All this stuff is stuff that I've picked up as I've gone around, and when I come back, try and turn it into a video that tells a story about what it's all about. Just a few weeks ago, the river that you can see behind me lazily flowing by was flooded and made thousands and thousands of people here in Niger homeless. So this was the site of where the villagers were living before the floods came. It's just a mud flat. The flood has flooded the houses and just dissolved them literally into the ground. This is the area where some of the people have come and built themselves very temporary shelters. When it rains and when the wind blows, the shelter is totally insecure for a proper family. So we're looking to replace some of these with ShelterBox tents to give them more security. The problem on this site is that after 2 months they have managed to construct some structures, but as you can see, the inside is very, very tentative. And you can see the light coming through on the outside, which shows that when it rains it comes in. Also, it's no protection from insects, which is a big problem. So we're looking to try and deal with the overcrowding. I mean, in an area of this size there are potentially 8 children in most of these structures, and everywhere you look here there are hundreds and hundreds of children in every camp. And what we're looking to do is to try and ease the overcrowding and provide them with some proper shelter. This is an area of Niamey down by the river. As you can see, the houses have been totally destroyed by the flood. People are endeavouring to rebuild them, but the governor of Niamey is refusing to provide them with any support because she believes that to do so just encourages them to stay and become victims of flooding yet again. These are some of the children who live here and whose homes were here before the flood. Bonjour!
Bonjour.
Basically this group here are the head of the village, and they're trying to work out how many adults, how many children, in order to complete the list for us so we know how many people we've helped here. Well, this is the list of names from the village with the number of adults, the number of children, and we've done 21 tents this morning, and the time now is just 20 to 1. It's one of the hottest parts of the day, and they brought along some food because they want to share, even though they have nothing. They want to share their food with us. Now, the real reason for showing that video in particular was that when I arrived in Niamey, I found a scout group, and I found the district commissioner, who was a guy of about 24, he wasn't very old, and they have an amazing scout network in Niamey with their own compound and lots of other facilities, and they provided me with scouts that came out and built tents all day long. We'd pick them up at 6 a.m. in the morning, and they had their own vehicle as well that had been provided, I think, from Belgium, where they were twinned with another scout group over in Belgium, and they came out every day and helped build tents. I also had members of the Niger Fire Service doing the same sort of thing. The difference between the two was indescribable. Every couple of hours, the fire service would down tools, go and have a rest or go and pray, and by lunchtime wend their way back to their barracks. The scouts, however, carried on working until 6 o'clock in the evening in temperatures of 100 degrees. It was just unbelievably hot, and they carried on relentlessly to work in those conditions to help the people that they were there to try and support. So Scouts can't do wrong in my eyes. The same applied in Nepal. I was asked to go to Nepal because of landslide and flooding, and this bit of video that I'm going to show you in a minute will explain a bit more about that. They'd had the heaviest monsoon they'd had for 53 years in Nepal. It was just before the earthquake struck. And there were over 1,000 centres where people were being housed in temporary shelters of whatever they could achieve. And what we did was to take hundreds of shelter boxes and go into the valleys where these people were cut off because the landslides had completely written off the roads. And my plan, having trekked 10 kilometres uphill and down dale to the first village, was to go back and then make contact with the government in Kathmandu through the rotary connections that we have, with a view to borrowing a Chinook helicopter. Part of our training involves using aircraft and various other things. Unfortunately, the Nepal government said, sorry, you're not having one of our Chinooks, we've only got 2, one of them's broken and the other one's too valuable to use for this kind of stuff. You can have 100 armed police force people instead. So I had to go down to the local barracks, negotiate with the police commander to give me 100 of his guys and some trucks. I had to go and buy some fuel for the trucks because they hadn't got any money for the fuel. And they drove us to the nearest drop-off point to the first village we were going to look at. And the video I'm going to show you explains how we managed to get the boxes from the roadhead over the valleys and the hills into the area where the villagers needed their support. Now, if you've ever been to Nepal, you'll know it's a beautiful country, and in flying over it, everything looks great from the air. But when you get down to ground level and you see the power of water and what it's done in moving thousands of tons of boulders and rock, it gives it a whole new meaning. And what on the one hand is a life-saving commodity, on the other becomes a massive tool of destruction. Our plan is to move in shelter boxes using the police service locally, and they're going to have to actually carry these boxes physically all the way from the roadway for over 3 hours to get to where we need to be.
Well, we walked an hour and a half this morning. We put up 5 tents. Now we're walking another 2 hours uphill over the valleys and every which way to put up another 6. And we've got to walk all the way back again. As you can see, it's fairly rocky terrain. How was that for you, Angela?
It's great. It's interesting crossing forwards like that every once in a while.
Beautiful village, ready to the party reverse.
Well, just as we thought we'd reached where we needed to go, we discover that we've got yet another headland to go over. Right, at this point we've been walking up some very rugged tracks, and we've come out onto this view where the countryside has suddenly opened out. Apparently we're near the village.
Might be over there.
And that's what did all the damage. This is the camp we've trekked 3 hours to get to. The people were living down by the river. Now they've moved up nearer the people who've got houses. They've managed to build themselves some very temporary shelters, but nothing that gives them real protection from more rains or any other serious sun problem. Okay, this was a home before the monsoon came, and it's now totally uninhabitable. Everything has completely fallen down. It's an idyllic spot in every other respect, but it really is not the place that we can help the family rebuild. So we're going to build a temporary arrangement over the other side on the land there.
Okay. Go inside.
जानुहोस् त ताली बजाइदिनु सबैले जाने बेला
Okay, done.
So I'll stop there. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them. But if you'd like to come and visit the ShelterBox display during the time you're here over the week, we'll be there waiting for you. And it could be your chance with your teams to win £100 on one of the challenges if you're successful in completing it in the fastest time. Or you might want to come and think about becoming a ShelterBox ambassador, in which case we'd be pleased to sign you up, give you a woven badge that you can stick on your uniform, and empower you to go and spread the word about ShelterBox, because the word that you can put through different scout groups and getting them to think about others in other parts of the world who are less fortunate could make a big, big difference. And there are lots of activities that you can undertake. One of them is a program at the moment we're calling Off the Grid, and it involves people being sponsored to go off, literally off power. So they're not allowed to use lights, phones, computers, anything that uses electricity for a period of 24 hours, and it'll help them experience what it's like to be affected by a disaster in the way that the people that we go and help from ShelterBox around the globe. But there are lots of things that you need to do this week, I'm sure, but any time you can spare to come and talk to ShelterBox, we'll be pleased to spread what we know about it with you. Yes.
Do you have any data on how long people stay in tents after you've given them shelter boxes? Like what's the period that they spend in tents?
It varies from place to place. The tents are designed to last a minimum of 6 months. The tents will withstand hurricane conditions of 120 kilometres an hour. They'll withstand flash flooding up to 8 inches deep. And they'll stop bugs, snakes and other horrible things getting into them. I slept in a tent in Haiti in a field that was surrounded by tarantula nests, and none of those little nasties got into the tent. It was absolutely safe. Normally, we would expect people to not be in a tent for more than 6 months. But I went to the Philippines on a different deployment for a super typhoon, and while I was there, I went and visited a site that we'd serviced 15 months previously, and people were still living in the ShelterBox tents of the type that you can see outside here. They'd built gardens around them, they'd put up fences, and they'd put some wriggly tin, corrugated iron, over the top to protect them further from the sun and the wind and the rain a bit more. But 15 months on, they were still living in ShelterBox tents, and they'd still got all the blankets, all the equipment that came with the box. They'd even got the gift certificate, because we always give the family a gift certificate to certify that this box is now their property, in the hope that if a government official comes along and tries to take it off them, they feel some sense of ownership and some authority over the property, because that's a gift from the donor who has provided the money in the first place. But ideally, we wouldn't expect people to be in the tents for more than 6 months. But in lots of cases, sadly, governments are not that effective around the globe, and they can be a lot longer. Yeah. Yes.
I imagine the contents of the box has changed over time. How do you review what goes into a shelter box?
Yeah, the box is constructed on the basis of what people need, not what they'd like. I go and talk to lots of schools, and one of the things I ask them is, what would you need if you were affected by a disaster? And they say, football, iPad. They just have no concept of what it's like to be in the places where people are affected by massive disaster of the nature that we're talking about. But the content of the box has remained pretty stable, I have to say. The most recent thing to have been added is solar lighting. And we put in 2 solar lights. They'll last 6 hours, give 6 to 8 hours of light at night. And they're called luminades. They collapse to a very tiny level, so they're easy to get in the box. They don't weigh much. And one of the problems, of course, that we have to think about is we're shipping these boxes around the world, and they have to be carried by people. So weight is an issue, because you pay transit charges according to weight as well. And so much of what is in the box has stayed much the same, although we've modified and improved things wherever we can. So if somebody brings out a new piece of kit, then we'll review it and look at replacing the older model or older style with the more up-to-date version. Another thing that's more up-to-date now is the water filtration. In the early days, we used to put in tablets, that were chlorinated tablets that would purify or at least kill the bugs in water, but the water tasted flipping horrible. Sadly, the people that we are often going to give these things to are not as worldly wise as maybe you or I might be if we got these things. They don't read instructions, and so they put a whole pack of these tablets in one small container of water, and you'd end up with something that looked like syrup. It wasn't effective and it wasn't practical. Then we got Life Straw, which was an individual tube, a bit like the microphone, and you had to suck through it to suck the water up. No good for elderly people or children, babies, because they couldn't suck the water through. Then Life Straw invented a different version that was gravity fed, which meant you just pour the water in the top, it runs down the tube and comes out the bottom. That was better, but the problem with that was it had 2 taps on it. One was blue and one was red. The red one, to you and I, would symbolise danger, and you turn on the blue tap and you get clean water. Unfortunately, after a while the thing would block up because it's got the capability. But if you turn on the red one, which was used really to flush it out, you started to get water again. Trouble was the water was now still the water that you'd put in the top, and so that became impractical. Now we've moved on to another thing that we've developed with the manufacturer called Thirst Aid, appropriately named, and it's simple. You bung water in a sack at the top, it runs down the bottom, comes out of a filter at the bottom, and it either works or it doesn't. You can unplug the filter, turn it around, blow through it, clean it out and stick it back on, and it'll start working again. So that's how we evolve over time in looking at what we do. And the same applies to the tent. Actually, if you visit our site, you'll see 3 different types of what we call our main relief tent, because each time they manufacture one, working with the manufacturers Vango, who designed the tent, we gradually learned from our experience on how to get a more robust or a better designed tent. And the ventilation, for example, on the most recent one, is designed better so it'll withstand rain and still ventilate the tent at the same time. So it's those kinds of things that are gradually evolving as time goes on. Our aim is to provide the best we possibly can in the fastest time possible to when people need it the most. Yes.
How many people are meant to fit in one of the tents?
Right, I've actually had 30 school children in the tent, all laying down, but it's not designed for that, of course. There is a humanitarian aid standard called Sphere Standards, and that recommends that each person should have an area of 2.4 square metres. Now, if you measured the tent, which is about 5 metres by 5 metres, if you divide that by 2. The actual area, it means you can probably get 3 3/4 people in the tent. So you've got to decide which leg you're going to leave out. Seriously, the tent is designed to home a family. And in some places, you'll get 10, 12 children sleeping in the tent. In other places, for example, Haiti, when things were really, really dire, it wasn't unusual for all the families to get together, put the children in the tents, and the parents sleep outside. When we go to disaster zones, very rarely do we have enough to help everybody. And so as a response team member, we have to make decisions on who we can help. We do that in conjunction with the leaders within the community. We look at how much aid we've got at that time, who is the most vulnerable at that time, and then we allocate on the basis of vulnerability. And needless to say, it's babies and small children and the elderly and the infirm who we would prioritise when giving the tents and the equipment out. But there isn't a simple one-size-fits-all answer to the question. It's about common sense and practicality and cooperation. When I go to a country, I'm a guest. I can't tell people how to behave. I'm not there to alter their culture. I'm not interested in their politics. I couldn't give a stuff what their religion is or whether they have any. I just care about people as human beings, and that's what ShelterBox is all about. It's about helping people at the lowest common denominator who have no one else who cares about them at a time of real angst and emergency. Okay, if there's no other questions, what I'd like to do is to invite anyone who'd like to come to the site now, on the ShelterBox site, to come and join us. Have a look at what we do, talk to us about how you might be interested in helping us further, or indeed about how we might help you to organise activities within your particular groups back in your home base. But while you're here, please take part in the challenges, because we've found already that people really have great fun in taking part in them. There's no getting wet, there's no climbing up very steep things or high things, there's no danger except enjoying yourself too much. Thank you very much for your time. Please enjoy the rest of the evening and the rest of your time at KIJ.